Hello and welcome to my channel. Are you ready for our story? Abrak, relax, and let yourself be swagged by the story. You'll learn about history and enjoy a peaceful night's sleep. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. The world before Wormimsm, the ancient contract between humanity and cold, long before the invention of central heating, before the age of radiators and insulated walls, before the soft hum of a thermostat keeping a home at a steady 70 degrees. Human beings faced winter with nothing but their wits, their community, and centuries of inherited knowledge. And among all who faced the cold, it was the elderly who bore its cruelest weight. Their bodies, slowed by time, could no longer generate the heat they once had. Their joints ached with every drop in temperature. Their circulation, weakened by age, left their fingers and feet perpetually numb, yet they survived. Generation after generation, in the frozen steppes of Central Asia, in the snow-blanketed villages of the northern, in the wind-scorched mountains of the ancient world, old men and lulled lived through winters that would claim the unprepared within hours. How they did so is one of history's most remarkable and least celebrated stories. To understand how the elderly survived, we must first understand what winter true meant in the pre-modern world. Today, cold is an inconvenience. In the ancient and medieval world, cold was an adversary with the power to end civilizations. The winters of the Little Ice Age, which gripped much of the northern hemisphere between roughly 300 and 800 to 50, were not the mild winters of modern memory. Rivers that had never frozen in recorded history turned to solid ice. The Thames in London froze hard enough to hold frost fairs, with markets and ox roastings taking place atop the river itself. In Scandinavia, entire villages were sometimes buried under snowfall that came in September and did not leave until May. In Russia, temperatures plunged so low that birds fell frozen from the sky mid-flight. This was the world the elderly of these eras inhabited, and they were expected not merely to endure it, but to remain functioning members of their communities throughout. The first and most fundamental strategy for surviving the cold was architectural. Across cultures, human beings learned, through painful trial and error over thousands of years, that the structure of one's dwelling was the first most important line of defense against winter death. The longhouses of the Norse and Germanic peoples were not simply large, they were engineering solutions to the problem of cold. Their low-pitched roofs were designed to accumulate snow, because snow, counterintuitively, is an extraordinary insulator. A thick blanket of snow on a roof could prevent almost all heat loss through the ceiling, turning what seemed like a burden into a thermal shield. The walls of these structures were built thick, often of timber, filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of woven branches packed with clay, animal dung, straw, and sometimes hair. This composite material, primitive by modern standards, was in fact remarkably effective at slowing the movement of heat from inside to outside. The elderly in these communities were given the privileged positions within these structures. In Norse households, the seat closest to the central hearth, the high seat, was not merely a place of honor for the eldest. It was a survival assignment. The hearth was the heart of the longhouse, a fire that burned for ambience but for life. Around it, the family slept, cooked, worked, breathed. And the person who needed warmth most reliably, the grandmother who could no longer run to warm her blood, the grandfather whose thin skin offered little insulation against the cold, was placed where the warmth was greatest. The hearth itself was a technological achievement that modern people tend to underestimate. An open fire in the center of a room with a smoke hole above seems simple. But the management of that fire across a long winter night was a complex and critical skill. The fire had to be built enough to warm the space, but not so large as to consume precious fuel reserves before spring. It had to be maintained through the night, which meant someone, often the youngest and most able-bodied members of the household, would take turns tending it. The elderly, for whom a cold night could be fatal, benefited from this collective labor. The family was, in the most literal sense, a survival unit. No individual survived winter alone, and the care of elders was woven the fabric of that survival structure. In the Norse tradition, the concept of the household fire carried deep spiritual significance. The hearth was considered the dwelling place of protective ancestral spirits. The house spirits, known across Germanic and Scandinavian cultures by various names, to let the fire go out was not merely a practical failure, but a spiritual one, an abandonment of the ancestors. This belief, whatever its theological origins, served an enormously practical purpose. It made the maintenance of the fire sacred, and sacred obligations, even when practical ones might be neglected out of laziness or exhaustion. Religion, in this sense, was also survival technology. Part 2.0. The body as battlefield, understanding cold's attack on the aging form. To truly appreciate the ingenuity with which ancient peoples protected their elderly through winter, we must understand what cold act does to the human body, and why it does it so much more efficiently and dangerously to the bodies of the old. The science of thermoregulation was not understood in the pre-modern world in any formal sense. People did not speak of core body temperature or hypothermia by those names, but they understood its effects with extraordinary precision because they observed them constantly, and because failure to respond correctly meant death. The human body is, at its core, a heat-producing engine. The metabolic processes that power our muscles, our organs, our brains, all of them generate heat as a byproduct. That heat is what keeps us at the roughly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, or 37 degrees Celsius, that our biology requires to function. When the environment around us is cold, body works to maintain that internal temperature through several mechanisms. It redirects blood flow away from the extremities and toward the core, protecting the vital organs at the cost of cold hands and feet. It triggers shivering, an involuntary rapid muscle contraction that generates heat through movement. and it raises the body's overall metabolic rate, burning more fuel, more food to maintain warmth. In a young, healthy adult, these mechanisms work well, but in the elderly, every one of them is compromised. The cardiovascular system, weakened by age, cannot redirect blood as efficiently. The muscles, reduced in mass and power by decades of use, shiver less effectively. The metabolic rate of an elderly person is significantly lower than that of a younger one, meaning they generate less baseline heat from the same amount of food, and crucially, the layer of subcutaneous fat that insulates the body against cold, the layer that lies just beneath the skin, thins dramatically with age, removing what is in effect the body's built-in winter coat. There is also a cruel neurological component to aging and cold. Older people frequently a diminished sensitivity to temperature. They may not feel cold as acutely as younger people do, which means they may not take action to warm themselves until the situation has already become dangerous. Modern emergency medicine has well-documented cases of elderly people found states of severe hypothermia who reported not feeling particularly cold. In the pre-modern world, where there was no hospital to rush to, this blunted sensitivity was a silent killer. The communities that learned to watch for its signs, to insist that the elder add another layer of wool, even when she said she was fine, to move grandfather closer to the fire, even when he insisted he was comfortable, were the communities whose elders survived. The ancient and medieval understanding of these facts was entirely empirical, built from scientific measurement, but from the accumulated observation of what happened to old people in cold weather and what prevented it. The result was a body of practical wisdom that was passed from generation to generation as folk knowledge, as custom, as the instructions a mother gave her daughter about how to care for the grandparents during a hard winter. Much of this wisdom has been lost, subsumed by the modern technological solutions that made it unnecessary. But where it survives in historical records, in archaeological evidence, and in the living traditions of peoples who still face genuine winter, it reveals a sophisticated and deeply compassionate understanding of what the aging body requires to survive the cold. Across many cultures, one of the most persistent pieces of this folk wisdom concerns the importance of keeping elderly in motion. We know today that physical activity raises core body temperature, increases circulation, and generates metabolic heat. The pre-modern world did not have this language, but it had the observation. Old people who were kept active, who were given tasks that required them to move, to use their hands, to walk short distances, even within the confined space of a winter-long house, fared better who were left to sit motionless for hours. The medieval household assigned the elderly tasks, carefully calibrated to their abilities. Spinning and carding wool, mending the gentering pots, the supervision of children. These were not merely acts of occupational dignity. They were health interventions, keeping the blood moving through bodies that could no longer reliably move it on their own. Part 3. clutch skin, the technology of textile survival. If the house was the first line of defense against winter death, clothing was the second. And for the elderly, it was often the more critical one, because clothing traveled with the body while the house remained fixed. The history of winter clothing in the pre-modern world is, in large part, a history of the lengths to which human beings would go to preserve the warmth of their most vulnerable members. Wool's perhaps the single most important material in the history of human survival through cold. Its properties are remarkable and were recognized, if not scientifically understood, from the earliest days of animal husbandry. Wool fiber is hollow at its core, trapping air within the fiber itself and creating an insulator layer that modern synthetic materials have struggled to fully replicate. Unlike cotton, which becomes cold and dangerous when wet, absorbing moisture and conducting heat away from the body, wool retains most of its insulating properties even when saturated. It can absorb up to 30% of its own weight in moisture before it begins to feel wet against the skin, and it is naturally fire-resistant, an important quality in a world where the elderly lived inches from obems. In the Norse Anglo-Saxon traditions, the preparation of wool for winter clothing was a year-round occupation, but one that intensified in the months before cold set in. Women, and it was almost always women who performed this labor, would spin raw fleece into yarn on handheld drop spindles. In more prosperous households, on upright, warp-weighted looms. The resulting cloth was woven in layers, with the densest weave reserved for outer garments and a looser, softer weave for the layers worn closest to the skin. For the elderly, who generated less body heat and had thinner skin, the number of layers was greater. An old woman in a Viking-age household might wear 3 or 4 layers of woolen garments simultaneously. A long linen undershift against the skin, a wool tunic over it, a heavier wool overdress or kirtle, and a great woolen cloak fastened at the shoulder, capable of being pulled around the entire body like a cocoon. Setting by the fire, the feet deserved particular attention in cold weather survival. And here, the ingenuity of pre-modern peoples was especially evident. Frostbite of the feet was a common cause of gangrene and death in winter, and among the elderly, whose shin was already compromised. Even moderate cold could cause dangerous damage to the toes and feet. Norse and Germanic peoples developed a system of footwear that addressed this through layering. Cloth foot wrap, essentially a square of woven material wound around the foot, was worn against the skin. Over this went a woolen sock, sometimes felted rather than knitted, which created a dense mat of fiber with exceptional insulating properties. Over the sock went a leather shoe, often stuffed with additional insulating material. Dried grass, which trapped air in its hollow stems. Moss, which could also serve a secondary purpose as moisture absorbent. Or animal fur, which provided yet another layer of protection. The result was a foot encased in multiple layers of insulation, each contributing its own thermal barrier. The head was understood, with no knowledge of modern thermodynamics, to be a critical point of heat loss. The Norse concept that substantial portion of body heat escapes through an uncovered head is embedded in the practical reality that the skull, this bone, was a bone with limited insulation, that the face and scalp are supplied with abundant blood vessels close to the surface, and that in cold air, an uncovered head can lead to meteoric drops in core temperature. For the elderly, head coverings in winter were not optional. Historical records and archaeological finds from sites across northern Europe consistently show wool caps, coifs, and layered head wraps among the textile objects associated with older individuals. In some medieval traditions, elderly people, particularly elderly women, were expected to keep their heads covered at all times indoors during winter, a practice that had both religious and deeply practical dimensions. Mittens rather than gloves were preferred in the coldest conditions, a choice with clear thermal logic behind it. Gloves, which separate the fingers, allow cold air to circulate around each digit individually. Mittens keep the fingers together in a shared thermal space, allow heat to collect across all four fingers. For an elderly person whose circulation already insufficient to keep the extremities warm, this difference could be the difference between functional hands and frostbitten ones. Archaeological finds from Iron Age and Viking Age sites in Norway and Iceland include mittens crafted from wool, from seal skin, and from the fur of Arctic foxes. Materials selected not for their appearance, but for their thermal performance in extreme conditions. Part fire, flail, and the economy of warmth, political and social dimensions of winter survival. The ability to keep warm through a pre-modern winter was not simply a matter of individual skill or personal virtue. It was a social and economic condition shaped by the distribution of resources, the structure of communities, and the obligations that bound people together. The elderly who survived were, in large part, those who were embedded in functioning social networks, families, village communities, religious institutions that ensured they had access to the fuel, food, and shelter that cold survival required. Fuel was everything. Without wood, peat, or dung to burn, no house could be kept warm, and no amount of clothing or our architectural ingenuity could fully compensate for the absence of fire. The gathering and storing and storage of winter fuel was therefore one of the central economic activities of the pre-modern agricultural calendar. And societies developed complex systems for ensuring even their most vulnerable members had enough. In medieval England, a right to gather firewood from the common woodland, a right known as a stover, was legally enshrined as one of the fundamental rights of rural tenants. Widows, among whom elderly women were heavily represented, were specifically protected in their right to a stover, recognizing that they could not gather wood themselves, and that without fuel, they would not survive winter. The quantity of fuel required heat. Pre-modern dwelling through a hard winter was enormous, and the logistics of securing it were a community effort. An old person living alone, or an elderly couple without grown children, could not possibly cut, haul, and stack the cords of wood required for a full winter. This was understood by village communities as a communal obligation. In many medieval European villages, it was customary for the community to gather before winter, and that the households of the elderly, the widowed, and the infirm were supplied with fuel. This was not charity in the modern sense. It was understood as a religious obligation, a social duty, and practical necessity, since the alternative was death on the doorstep. The type of fuel mattered as much as the quantity. Hardwoods, oak, ash, hornbeam, burned longer in hotwoods, and were therefore more valuable for keeping a fire alive through a long winter night. Peat, cut from bogs and dried over the summer months, was the primary fuel in regions like Ireland, Scotland, and the Low Countries, where woodland was scarce but boggy ground was plentiful. A peat fire burned slowly and produced sustained heat for hours, making it particularly well suited to nighttime use. Banked with a thick layer of ash at bedtime, a peat fire could hold its embers until morning, when it could coaxed back to full flame with minimal additional fuel. For elderly people who could not safely manage a large, active fire at night, the slow steadiness of banked peat was a lifesaver. In Scandinavia and parts of Germany, the development of the masonry stove, an enclosed ceramic or stone heating device that captured and stored heat far more efficiently than an open hearth, represented a revolution in winter survival for the elderly. Unlike an open fire, which sent most of its heat up the chimney and required constant tending, the masonry stove absorbed heat into its dense ceramic or stone mass during burning, then radiated that stored warmth slowly back into the room over the course of many hours. A single firing of a well-built masonry stove in the afternoon could keep a room warm through the entire night without additional fuel. For elderly people who could not safely tend a fire during the night hours, whose eyesight was failing, whose mobility was limited, who might knock over a burning lamp in a moment of confusion, the masonry stove removed a significant nighttime danger while also providing superior and more warmth. The economics of winter food were inseparable from the economics of winter survival. Cold kills hungry people far faster than well-fed ones, because the metabolic heat that keeps the body warm is generated from the food we eat. An elderly person who was malnourished entering winter, who had not consumed enough calories to maintain a healthy layer of body fat, was at severe physiological disadvantage when temperatures dropped. The pre-modern agricultural calendar was, in large part, organized around this reality. The autumn slaughter, the preservation of meats, the storage of root vegetables, grains, and preserved fruits were all preparations for the metabolic demands of winter, and within households, the elderly were given priority access to the most calorie-dense foods, rendered animal fat, preserved meats, dense barley porridge enriched with butter or lard. A bowl of hot porridge containing significant quantities of fat was not merely comfort food in the pre-modern winter. It was thermal medicine. Part 5a. The wisdom of animals sharing body heat across species, one of the most striking and consistently documented strategies for surviving winter cold across pre-modern cultures is one that modern sensibilities tend to find surprising. The deliberate sharing of sleeping and living space with domestic animals. Cattle, sheep, goats, and horses are warm-blooded creatures whose bodies generate substantial heat, and the peoples of Northern Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East recognized this fact and incorporated into their winter survival of architecture with remarkable intentionality. The Norse and Germanic longhouse, in its full traditional form, was not merely a human dwelling. It was a combined human and animal shelter, with the livestock occupying one end of the structure and the human family occupying the other. The animals, cattle in particular, which are large, warm creatures producing significant metabolic heat, functioned as biological furnaces. The heat generated by a dozen or more cattle in an enclosed space is substantial, and it flowed freely through the shared interior of the longhouse, supplementing the hearth fire and reducing the fuel required to maintain a survivable temperature. For elderly members of the household who spent the coldest hours of one night in the sleeping area closest to the animal end of the longhouse, this arrangement was not merely practical. It was often life-saving. Archaeological evidence from longhouse sites across Scandinavia, Iceland, and Scotland confirms this arrangement with remarkable consistency. Floor deposits show the distinct patterns of human and animal occupation in adjacent but connected spaces, with the cattle byre and the human living area separated in some cases by nothing more than a low partition. The smell, by modern standards, would have been overwhelming. The noise of cattle shifting and lowing through the night would have been constant, but the warmth would have been real and reliable in a way that nothing else in the pre-modern world could match, except the hearth fire itself. In the nomadic cultures of the Eurasian steppe, the Mongols, the various Turkic peoples, the Syrian groups who lived in seasonal camps rather than permanent settlements, the relationship between human winter survival and animal body heat was even more direct. The felt-covered yurt, the iconic dwelling of the steppe nomad, was insulated with layers of compressed wool that could reduce internal temperature loss dramatically. But in the coldest nights of the Central Asian winter, when temperatures fall to 40 or 50 degrees below 0 Celsius, even the best insulated yurt required additional heat sources. Livestock, particularly horses, whose body temperature runs slightly higher than that of cattle, were sometimes brought inside the dwelling during extreme cold events. For elderly members of nomadic communities who were given sleeping positions of greatest warmth, this proximity to large warm-bodied animals was an essential component of survival. The use of smaller animals for warmth was also documented across multiple cultures and time periods. Domestic dogs, which have sleeping in human beds since the earliest days of domestication, were not merely companions in the pre-modern world. They were thermal resources, A large dog sleeping against an elderly person's back or legs provided a consistent, safe, and easily managed source of warmth through the night hours. The Australian Aboriginal peoples coined the phrase three-dog night, a night so cold that 3 dogs were needed for warmth. But the practice of sleeping with dogs for warmth was global and ancient, appearing in records from medieval Europe, pre-Columbian North America, and across Asia. For an elderly person whose body could no longer generate adequate heat independently, a large dog sleeping beside them could provide just enough additional warmth to maintain a safe core temperature through a cold night. Part 6. Mystery of cold serval food, drink, and the internal fire. The pre-modern world did not understand calories, metabolic rate, or the chemistry of thermogenesis. But it understood with empirical precision, earned through centuries of observation, which foods and drinks kept people warm through winter, and which did not. The dietary wisdom surrounding winter survival for the elderly was rich, specific, and often counterintuitive by the standards of modern nutritional advice. Fat was the first and most universally recognized winter survival food. Every traditional culture that faced genuine developed some variant of a high-fat winter diet. And the lodgment. Fat is the most calorie-dense macronutrient available in the pre-modern food supply, providing more than twice the energy per gram of either protein or carbohydrate. In a cold environment where the body must burn more fuel simply to maintain its core temperature, this energy density matters enormously. The Norse ate preserved, fatty meats through winter: salt-cured pork and mutton, dried fish packed in rendered fat, skyr enriched with cream. The indigenous peoples of the Arctic consumed diets so high in fat that they would be considered dangerously imbalanced by modern Western nutritional standards. Yet they survived winters of extraordinary severity. For the elderly members of these communities, access to fatty foods was not a luxury, it was a physiological requirement. Hot food and hot drinks occupied a special place in the winter survival repertoire across virtually every cold weather culture. We understand today that consuming hot food does not, in fact, significantly raise core body temperature in a direct physiological sense. The quantity of heat delivered by even a bowl of very hot soup is small compared to the body's overall thermal mass. But the psychological warming effect is real. The peripheral vasodilation caused by warmth in the mouth and throat provides temporary relief from cold extremities. And perhaps most importantly, the act of consuming hot food requires a functioning fire, which the person consuming it is, by definition, near a heat source. For the elderly, the ritual of hot meals, morning porridge, midday broth, evening stew, structured the day around regular contact with the warmth of the hearth, and ensured that it 3 times daily. The old and the cold were gathered in the warmest part of the dwelling. Fermented beverages served a role in winter survival that went beyond their obvious social functions. Ale, mead, and fermented milk products were present in virtually every pre-modern cold weather culture. and their consumption was associated with warmth in the folk understanding of every culture that produced them. The physiological reality is nuanced. All cause is peripheral vasodilation, which produces the subjective sensitive sensation of warmth by increasing blood flow to the skin, but simultaneously increases the rate of heat loss from the body's core by bringing warm blood to the surface. In other words, alcohol makes you feel warmer while actually making you cold faster. A fact that has contributed to countless hypothermia deaths in the modern era. The pre-modern world, which consumed beverages in relatively modest quantities by modern standards, and which did so primarily in warm, enclosed spaces, rarely encountered this danger in its lethal form. A cup of warm spiced mead by the hearth fire contributed to the social and psychological dimensions of winter warmth more than its biochemistry would suggest. Certain herbs and spices were specifically associated with winter warming in medieval European, Central Asian, and East Asian medical traditions. Ginger, which produces a genuine sensation of warmth through its active compounds, was used in winter drinks and foods across Asia, and eventually in Europe following the spice trade's expansion. Black pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, expensive and therefore accessible primarily to wealthier households, were incorporated into winter preparations with the explicit understanding that they contributed to bodily warmth. In the folk medicine traditions of medieval Europe, certain herbal preparations were given specifically to elderly people during winter, with the stated purpose of maintaining the body's internal fire. Many of these preparations contained compounds that we now know have genuine circulatory effects, including mild vasodilatory properties that could in small ways help maintain blood flow to the extremities. The eating schedule of winter differed significantly from that of summer in the pre-modern world, and this difference had important implications for the elderly. Summer work required sustained energy output across long working days, and this demanded regular food consumption at intervals throughout the day. Winter, with its shorter days and reduced physical labor demands, might seem to call for less food, and in terms of raw caloric expenditure, this was partially true, but the need to maintain core body temperature in cold conditions meant that the elderly required more regular caloric input in winter than in summer, even if their physical activity had decreased. The traditional winter meal pattern, a large, hot, fetch breakfast before coldest hours of the morning, a substantial midday meal of preserved meats and root vegetable stew, and an evening meal by the fire before the long cold night, reflected in an intuitive understanding of this need. Part 7: Community as Survival Strategy. The social architecture of winter. Perhaps the most important survival technology available to the elderly in the pre-modern winter was not architectural, not textile, not dietary, but social. The structure of the community, the obligations it imposed, the networks it maintained, the physical arrangements created during the cold months, determined who lived and who died with greater reliability than almost any other factor. And it is here, in the social and communal dimensions of winter survival, that the pre-modern world offers its most profound lessons. The extended family household was, across virtually all pre-modern cultures, the basic unit of winter survival. The nuclear family, 2 parents and their children, was not only socially unusual in most pre-modern contexts, but physiologically inefficient as a survival unit. A larger household meant more bodies generating heat in the shared sleeping space. It meant more hands to tend the fire, gather fuel, prepare food, and care for the sick. It meant that when illness struck an elderly person, as it inevitably did in the cold and dark of winter, there were people present to provide care, to ensure that food and warmth were maintained, to prevent the cascade of deterioration that begins when a cold person stops eating and stops moving. The grandparents who lived with their adult children and grandchildren were not merely cultural conveniences. They were participants in a thermal and logistical system in which everyone's presence contributed to everyone else's survival. In Norse and Germanic cultures, the concept of the winter hall, the shared indoor space in which the entire household lived, worked, ate, and slept during the cold months, was the physical expression of this communal thermologic. The summer dispersal of family members, outbuildings, field shelters, and separate sleeping arrangements was reversed each autumn as cold approached. Rooms that had been used independently through the summer became shared sleeping spaces. Bodies were packed more closely together, not merely from necessity, but from deliberates. Because shared body heat across a group of sleepers is significantly more effective than individual body heat alone. Elderly family members slept in the center of these sleeping arrangements, surrounded on all sides by the warm bodies of younger relatives whose metabolic furnaces ran hotter. The religious calendar of medieval Europe was structured in ways that are not coincidental around the demands of winter survival. The period from late November through early January, encompassing Advent, Christmas, and the 12 days, was a season of deliberate communal gathering, of feasting, of the distribution of food and fuel among the needy, and of the maintenance of fire. The Christian obligation to care for the sick and elderly during winter was expressed both in the liturgical emphasis on charity and in the specific practices of parish communities. The visitation of the housebound, the distribution of alms that included food and fuel, the gathering of the community in the warmth of the church building for services that also served to bring isolated individuals into contact with warmth and human company. The monasteries of medieval Europe played a particularly important role in winter survival for the elderly poor. Monastic institutions maintained almshouses, heated buildings where the destitute elderly could find refuge during the coldest months. They distributed food at the monastery gates, a practice that was not merely symbolic but physiologically cruel for old people who could not provide for themselves. The monastic infirmary, with its dedicated heating arrangements and its staff of monks or nuns trained in the basic care of the sick, of the sick and elderly represented the closest thing to modern elder care that the pre-modern world possessed. An elderly person who reached the gates of a monastery in winter had a significantly better chance of surviving to spring than one who remained isolated in a cold and poorly provisioned home across cultures and continents. One of the most consistent features of winter survival arrangements for the elderly was the practice of communal sleeping in shared, heated spaces. In Scandinavia, entire households slept together in the same bed. A vast, communally shared sleeping platform heaped with fur and wool blankets as a deliberate thermal strategy. In Japan, the kotatsu, a low table with a heat source beneath it and a heavy blanket draped over its sides, became a center of family winter life precisely because it concentrated warmth in a shared space where multiple people, including the elderly, could benefit simultaneously. In the yurts of the steppe nomads, sleeping arrangements were organized with careful attention to warmth. With the elderly positioned near the fire and surrounded the bodies of younger family members. The specific forms differed, but the principle was universal. The elderly survived winter through proximity to warmth, and human bodies were as an important a source of that warmth as any fire. Part 8. The healing tradition of Redishans. When medicine, magic, and cold weather care, when cold weather illness struck the elderly, and it inevitably did, because even the best managed winter arrangements couldn't entirely prevent the respiratory infections, joint crises, and circulatory emergencies that winter brought. The pre-modern world responded with a body of medical practice. He blended genuine therapeutic wisdom with spiritual practice in ways that modern medicine is only beginning to reassess. The respiratory illnesses that cold weather triggers or worsens, bronchitis, pneumonia, pleurisy, were the primary winter killers of the elderly in the pre-modern world, as they remain today. An elderly person's lungs are elastic, less efficient at clearing infection, more susceptible to secondary bacterial pneumonia following a viral respiratory infection than a younger person's. In a world without antibiotics, such severe winter's chest infection in an old person was frequently a death sentence. The pre-modern medical response to this reality was not passive resignation, but active management built on centuries of accumulated observation about what helped and what did not. Steam inhalation, the practice of breathing vapor from a vessel of hot water, often infused with aromatic herbs, appears in the folk metal traditions of virtually every cold weather culture, and with good reason. We understand today that steam inhalation does not kill respiratory pathogens, but does loosen mucus, reducing the effort required for productive coughing, and temporarily Laten's airways narrowed by inflammation. Eucalyptus, which contains compounds with genuine bronchodilatory and antimicrobial properties, was used in this way in Australian Aboriginal medicine. In European tradition, pine resin, thyme, and various members of the mint family served similar purposes. An elderly person propped over a steaming pot of herb-infused water and covered with a cloth to concentrate the vapors was receiving, by the standards of pre-modern medicine, highly competent respiratory care. The application of heat to the chest and back through heated stones wrapped in cloth, through poultices of warmed herbs, through what medieval European medicine called the hot brick, was another widespread and genuinely effective practice. Heat applied to the chests provides physiological benefit during respiratory illness. It relaxes the muscles of the chest wall, reducing the pain of pleurisy. It improves local circulation, supporting the immune response, and it provides the subjective experience of comfort that reduces the metabolic cost of distress and allows the body to direct more resources toward healing. The medieval European practice of laying a heated stone wrapped in cloth against the back of an elderly person with chest infection, empirically sound thermal medicine, whatever its theoretical justification in humoral terms. Soups and broths were prescribed as medicine for the elderly sick across every traditional medical system we have detailed records of, and modern science has vindicated this ancient wisdom to a surprising degree. Hot chicken broth, the quintessential sick food of European and Asian tradition, contains compounds derived from the cartilage and connective tissue of bones that have genuine anti-inflammatory properties. The heat and vapor of hot soup serves the same airway opening functions as direct steam inhalation. The salts dissolved in broth help maintain electrolyte balance in people weakened by fever. The fat in a well-browned broth provides dense calories to a body that has lost its appetite. And the act of eating hot broth requires proximity to the fire that prepared it. Places warm liquid throughout the digestive tract and provides a visceral sensation of warmth that has genuine psychological and physiological benefits. The instruction to give the sick elderly broth and keep them by the fire was, by any reasonable assessment, excellent medical advice. The spiritual dimensions of winter medical care for the elderly were not, in the pre-modern understanding, separate from the physical ones. The Norse believed that illness in winter could be caused by the actions spirits were more active during the dark months. The Draugr, the Dorand, the Landwighty, and that the protective charms worn by the elderly served real functions in maintaining health. The medieval Christian understanding of illness as spiritual as well as physical condition meant that the prayers offers for a sick elderly person, the blessings of sacred objects placed near the sick bed, the visits of priests who anointed the sick, all served purposes that their recipients experienced as genuinely comforting and strengthening. We understand today that the relationship between psychological state and immune function is real and significant. That people who feel cared for, spiritually supported, and not alone have measurably better outcomes from illness than those who do not. The pre-modern world's integration of spiritual care into its medical treatment of the elderly sick may, in this light, have been more sophisticated than it initially appears. Part 9. The geography of cold survival how different cultures solved the same problem. The challenge of keeping elderly people alive through severe winter was not to any one culture or region. It was universal wherever human beings lived in cold climates. And the solutions devised were diverse, creative, and powerfully adapted to the specific resources and conditions of each environment. A survey of these solutions across cultures reveals both the universality of the underlying problem and the remarkable ingenuity of its many solutions. In Japan, the traditional approach to winter warmth for the elderly was built around the strategic management of small amounts of heat, rather than the maintenance of large fires. The Japanese house of the pre-modern era was, by the standards of Northern Europe, poorly insulated against cold. Its sliding paper screens and elevated wooden floors designed for summer ventilation at the expense of winter heat retention. But within this challenging thermal environment, the Japanese developed heating solutions of elegant efficiency. The kotatsu, which dates in its basic form to at least the 14th century, concentrated warmth in the body's core by placing a small heat source, initially charcoal embers in a clay pot heater, in increasingly sophisticated heating elements, beneath a table covered by a heavy quilted blanket that trapped the rising warmth. An elderly person sitting at the kotatsu, their legs and lower body enclosed in this warm pocket, could maintain a comfortable core temperature even in a room that was, by their head, quite cold. The hibashi, a small ceramic or metal vessel containing glowing charcoal, was carried from room to room as a portable personal heat source, placed near the elderly and infirm as needed. The indigenous peoples of the Arctic, the Inuit, the Yupik, the various groups who inhabited the most extreme cold environments on Earth, developed a technological solution to winter, who winters are survival that represented, and still represents, some most sophisticated cold weather engineering in human history. The igloo, often dismissed in popular culture as a primitive improvisation, is in fact a thermally brilliant structure whose design principles were understood by its builders with exquisite precision. Snow is an insulator, not a conductor of cold, and the compressed snow blocks of the igloo wall, carefully shaped to create a dome without mortar, provided thermal insulation comparable to several inches of modern foam insulation. The elevated sleeping platform inside the igloo, raised above the floor to stay above the coldest air, which sinks by convection, was positioned the thermally optimal height in the structure. The tunnel entrance, angled downward, prevented cold air from flowing directly into the living space by exploiting the physics of cold air's tendency to sink, and the combination of body heat from several occupants, including any dogs permitted inside, with a single small oil lamp burning seal fat, could raise the interior temperature of an igloo to a humanly comfortable level, even when the outside temperature was -40. For elderly members of Inuit communities, the igloo represented an extraordinarily effective survival environment. Its small size concentrated the warmth of multiple occupants more efficiently than a larger space. The sleeping platform, covered with multiple layers of caribou hide, provided insulation between the sleeper and the cold ground. The fur clothing worn inside, double-layered caribou skin, with the fur on different surfaces to trap maximum air, provided a personal thermal environment that was, in many ways, superior to what was available to the Eldorado poor in the richest cities of medieval Europe. The Inuit solution to winter was not to fight the cold with large fires and massive quantities of fuel, resources the Arctic did not provide, but to work with cold's own physics, using snow's insulating properties and the biology of warm-blooded bodies to maintain life in conditions that seem to modern sensibilities almost incompatibly severe with human survival. In the Han Chinese tradition, the Kang, a sleeping platform built over a system of flues through which hot gases from a cooking fire were channeled, represented an approach to winter warmth that was architecturally integrated rather than added on. The Kang dates back at least 2,000 years in northern China and remains in use today in rural areas of northeastern China and Korea, where it is called the ondol. Its principle is simple but thermally effective. The mass of the stone or earthen sleeping platform absorbs heat from the cooking fire's exhaust gases, stores it in the dense material, and releases it slowly back into the sleeping space over the course of the night. Cooking a meal heats the platform that the family then sleeps on, making dual use of fuel that would in other systems be wasted up a chimney. For elderly members of the Chinese family who spent the long winter nights on the Kang surrounded by younger family members, this arrangement provided consistent, safe, radiant warmth throughout the coldest hours, with no open flame and no need for nighttime fire tending. The pastoral nomads of Central Asia, the various Turkic, Mongolian, and Iranian-speaking peoples of the steppe and mountains faced the paradox of surviving extreme cold while maintaining the mobility that their herding lifestyle required. Their solution was the yurt, a portable structure that could be dismantled in hours and transported on pack animals, yet which provided thermal comfort in conditions as severe as the Siberian winter. The yurt's insulating properties came primarily from its felt covering, multiple layers of compressed wool felt, thick enough in the coldest regions to absorb almost no heat from the interior. The circular form was not merely aesthetically traditional but the optimal, thermally optimal. A circle has the minimum possible perimeter for a given area, meaning a circular structure loses less heat through its walls than any other floor plan of the same size. The central fire, with its opening in the roof above, created a convective air circulation that distributed warmth evenly through the interior. For elderly nomads, the innermost sleeping position, closest to the central fire and surrounded by the bodies of family members, represented the culmination of a sophisticated mobile thermal technology. Part 10. The night, dangerous hours. Of all the challenges that winter presented to the elderly of the pre-modern world, the nighttime hours, roughly from sunset to dawn, a span of 15 or more hours in the deepest winter of northern latitudes, were the most dangerous. During the day, physical activity generated warmth. The presence of sunlight provided some radiant heat, however minimal. Social activity kept people in proximity to one another and to heat sources. But the night was a different world, a world of stillness, darkness, cold, and isolation, in which the body's own heat production slowed with sleep, and in which pending might lapse, and in which hypothermia could develop silently in a sleeping person who would not wake in time to save themselves. The management of the sleeping environment for the elderly was therefore one of the most carefully considered aspects of winter serveratus across virtually all cold weather cultures. The fundamental principle was the same everywhere. Maximum insulation, maximum proximity to warmth, and minimum exposure to cold air. The specifics varied enormously closely by culture and available materials. In medieval Northern Europe, the bed itself was the primary thermal refuge of the cold night. The great bed of the medieval household, a massive wooden structure with curtaining sides and a canopy above, was not merely a status symbol, though it was that too. It was a thermal enclosure, tent of cloth within the larger space of the bedroom, designed to capture the body heat of its occupants and maintain a warm microclimate that the larger room could not provide. The curtains of the bed, drawn closed at night, reduced air circulation around the sleepers, trapping the heat their bodies generated and raising the internal temperature of the sleeping space significantly above that of the surrounding room for an elderly person sleeping in such a bed. Ideally, with one or additional people whose body heat would supplement their own. The bed curtains created a survivable thermal environment, even when the room around them was bitterly cold. The bedding materials of the pre-modern world were selected with empirical wisdom for their thermal properties. Wool, which retained warmth even when compressed by the weight of a sleeping body, formed the primary insulating layer. Feathers, particularly the down of waterfowl, whose thermal properties were recognized as superior to those of coarser feathers, were used in filled coverlets and mattresses in households wealthy enough to afford them. A goose down filled coverlet, like its modern equivalent, provided exceptional insulation with minimal weight, allowing the sleeper to move freely while remaining warm. Archaeological finds and historical inventories from European households consistently show the most and best bedding associated with the sleeping spaces of the elderly, reflecting a community understanding that thermal maintenance during sleep was a particular necessity for older people. The question of nighttime fire management, one of the most practically challenging aspects of winter survival. A fire maintained through the night required fuel and tending. Fuel was expensive and labor-intensive to acquire. Tending a fire at 2 in the morning required someone to be awake and able-bodied. For elderly people living alone or in households where the younger members worked so hard during the day that they could not afford to lose sleep at night, this presented a genuine dilemma. The solutions developed across cultures were diverse and ingenious. In Scotland and Ireland, the custom of banking the fire, covering it with a thick layer of ash, and perhaps peat dust before bed, was not merely practical, but ritualized to the point of religious significance. The Gaelic practice of smothering the fire involved specific prayers and invocations that served to ensure the spiritual as well as physical protection of the household through the night. The practical result was that properly banked fire could maintain live embers for 8 hours under a layer of ash, requiring only the addition of fuel and some gentle blowing to restore it to full flame in the morning. A household in which this practice was reliably performed went to sleep with warmth, awoke to the possibility of rapid rewarming. A significant advantage over a household which the fire was allowed to die entirely, requiring a cold starting fire to be built from scratch on a freezing morning. The development of enclosed heating devices. The masonry stove in Central and Northern Europe, the kang in East Asia, the tandoor in Central Asia and the Middle East, represented, in many ways, the culmination of millennia of human effort to maintain warmth through the dangerous hours of the cold night. Each of these devices tests the nighttime fire maintenance problem by storing heat is thermal mass rather than relying on active combustion. Each allowed a household to fire once, store the resulting heat in stone or ceramic or earthen mass, and release it slowly through the night without attention or additional fuel. Each was developed independently in different parts of the world by peoples who had no contact with one another. A striking example of technological convergence driven by shared physiological necessity. Part 11. When survival failed, death, memory, and the meaning of cold. Not everyone survived. The historical and archaeological record makes clear that winter cold was a significant cause of death among the elderly in the pre-modern world, and that the strategies described throughout this account, however effective, were not sufficient to save everyone. Understanding how and why winter survival failed as important to this story as understanding how it succeeded, because it illuminates both the limits of pre-modern knowledge and the social and economic conditions that determined who lived and who did not. The elderly who died in winter were, disproportionately, those who were poor. The correlation between poverty and winter death is one of the most consistent findings in the historical demography of cold weather societies. A wealthy elderly person in medieval England had access to well-built housing, abundant fuel, high-quality food, warm clothing, attentive servants, and skilled medical care. A poor elderly widow had a drafty dwelling, scarce fuel, and inadequate food, worn-out clothing, and no one to tend her through the night. The same cold night that was a mild inconvenience for the first was potentially a death sentence for the second. The medieval church's repeated emphasis on the obligation to provide for the elderly poor during winter reflected an awareness of this disparity and an attempt to mitigate it through organized charity. An attempt that was inevitably only partially successful. The harvest failure years were the most deadly for the elderly. In a year when the harvest was poor, whether from drought, flood, early frost, disease, or the depredations of war. The food stores that were supposed to sustain the household through winter were insufficient. When food ran short, the elderly were often the first to suffer. Not necessarily through deliberate neglect, but through the harsh arithmetic of survival. A household that could not feed everyone might unconsciously prioritize the young and working age over the old. The demographic records of medieval Europe show spikes in elderly mortality in the winters following poor harvests, and the pattern repeats across other pre-modern societies with sufficient documentation to reveal it. The deaths that cold brought to the elderly were not always dramatic. They did not always arrive in the form of a sudden and obvious freezing. More often, they came through the gradual accumulation of cold weather stresses. The chest infection that worsened over 2 weeks until the lungs could no longer function. The fall on ice that broke a hip and condemned an elderly immobility just as winter deepened. The gradual decline in food consumption that left the body's thermal reserves depleted. The circulation crisis that arrived silently in the night. The pre-modern world recognized these patterns, named them in their folk understanding. The winter that takes the old, the cold that gets into the bones and never leaves, and incorporated the recognition into their care practices. But recognition was not always sufficient for prevention. The deaths of elderly people in winter were mourned in the pre-modern world, with a mixture of grief and a pragmatic acceptance that modern sensibilities may find difficult. Death was more present in the pre-modern world at all seasons, but it was most present in winter, and the death of the old in winter had, for most pre-modern peoples, a quality of natural completion that was understood within a larger framework, all cycles of life and death as aspects of same occurring pattern. This does not mean that such deaths were not mourned. The evidence from grave goods, memorial practices, and literary expressions of grief makes clear that they were. But they were also understood differently. As the winter taking its due, as the natural end of a life, had been long as the departure of those who had fulfilled their role in the household and the community, and could now depart before the harshest season made their continued survival a burden they could no longer bear. Part 12. The legacy of cold survival knowledge, the pasts, the present, the knowledge accumulated over millennia by pre-modern peoples about surviving winter cold did not disappear when central heating, modern medicine, and global food supply chains made it apparently unnecessary. It persists in folk practice, in architectural tradition, in dietary custom, and in the care practices of communities that still face genuine winter without the full support of modern technology. And increasingly, as researchers and public health experts grapple with the ongoing mortality crisis of cold weather among the modern elderly, a crisis that kills tens of thousands of people in developed countries every year, even with heating systems and emergency services available. The wisdom embedded in these ancient practices has scientific and policy attention. The modern elderly die of cold in numbers that would surprise most people who assume that hypothermia is a problem only for those lost in the wilderness. In the United Kingdom alone, the excess winter mortality among people over 65, deaths in winter above the baseline rate of other seasons, has averaged in recent decades between 20,000 and 40,000 per year. In the United States, cold-related deaths among the elderly number in the thousands annually, with many more attributable to the indirect effects of cold on cardiovascular and respiratory health. The pattern is consistent across developed countries. Cold kills old people in large numbers, and it does so even in societies with abundant heating technology and social welfare systems, because the effective implementation of that technology requires money, functioning social networks, and practically that not all elderly people possess. The insights of the pre-modern world speak directly to this modern problem. The absolute centrality of social embeddedness, of having people who check on you, who ensure your fire is lit, who bring you food and assess your is as relevant today as it was in the longhouse of a 10th century Norse farmstead. The importance of maintained physical activity for generating body heat applies to a modern elderly person in a poorly heated apartment as directly as it applied to a medieval grandmother in a winter hall. The superior insulating properties of layered wool clothing are as true today as they were in the Bronze Age. The value of hot, fat food in maintaining the thermal resources of an aging body is confirmed by modern nutritional science. What the pre-modern world understood through accumulated experience and cultural wisdom, and what modern medicine and public health are rediscovering through formal research, is that cold weather survival for the elderly is not primarily a technological problem. It is a social one. The elderly who served the winters of the pre-modern world survived because they were embedded in communities that understood what they needed and organized themselves to provide it. The elderly who die of cold today in warm and prosperous countries die disproportionately in isolation, alone in their homes, unknown to their neighbors, disconnected from the social networks that once constituted humanity's primary thermal survival technology. The great longhouse is gone. The communal wind hall is gone. The centuries of empirical wisdom about which herb to steam, to position by the fire, to assign to the grandmother, which foods to prioritize in the stores for the oldest members of the household. Much of this is gone, and its loss is not merely a cultural impoverishment, but a practical one. What remains? What the story of the elderly in the pre-modern winter ultimately owes to those willing to listen is the understanding that survival, at its deepest level, is not a solitary achievement. It is a collective one. The warm body beside you in the night, the neighbor who knocks to ensure your fire still burns, the child brings food without being asked, the community that organizes its care around those who most need it. These are not our archaic virtues or romantic fantasies about a simpler time. They are survival technology. They have always been survival technology. and they remain even in the age of central heating and emergency services. Among the most powerful tools available for keeping the old alive through the cold, apolology, the fire that still burns, a final reflection. Tonight, in the northern hemisphere, the temperature will fall. In cities and in villages, in well-insulated apartments, and in poorly heated homes, in the rooms of the comfortable and the dwellings of the poor, elderly people will face the ancient challenge of the cold night. Most of them will be fine. Their heating systems will function, their blankets will be sufficient. Their bodies will maintain the warmth they need. But some of them, far more than we acknowledge, far more than a society with our resources and knowledge should accept, will struggle, and some of them will not survive to see the spring. The people who faced this same challenge 10 centuries ago, or 5 centuries ago, or 50 years ago in a village without electricity, faced it without our technology, but not without our intelligence, and not without our compassion. They built their houses against the cold with the best materials and designs available to them. They wrapped their elderly in the warmest clothing they could make. They shared their sleeping space and their body heat. They organized their communities around the knowledge that winter was an adversary that could not be faced alone. They watched, and they cared, and they remembered what had worked and what had not. And they passed that knowledge forward to those who came after them. That knowledge, that care, that fundamental understanding that the survival of the old is a responsibility of the young. This is the real inheritance of the long winter. Not the masonry stove or the wool mitten or the correct way to bank a fire. Though these things have their place, the inheritance is the understanding that warmth is not merely physical condition, is a social one, and that the fire that truly keeps the old alive through the cold is not the one burning in the hearth, but the one burning in the human heart. The unwillingness to let those came before us face the dark and the cold alone. That fire has burned in every human community that has ever survived a winter. It burns still wherever people choose to tend it. And as long as it does, the old will not face the cold nights of winter alone.